Can the European Central Bank help to stop climate change? You can see it now. So recently, the European Central Bank has been thinking about how to help to stop and combat the climate crisis. And in order to do that, the ECB, which is the abbreviation for the European Central Bank, did a stress test that is basically trying to find out under certain scenarios what happens to an economy. And the stress test they did was about climate-related risks to companies in Europe. So basically the idea is that the climate crisis poses a considerable risk to companies in Europe, and that can have destabilizing effects on financial markets. You see that this is already a very capitalist framework, and that the ECB is thinking in long terms about how capitalism will continue to work in the future, and the idea that despite the climate crisis wreaking havoc on the planet, that everything will go on as usual, which is already a very naive thinking in my view. So basically, the idea in this stress test is that due to the climate crisis, companies in Europe will suffer losses and will be less profitable. And this can have two causes. So on the one hand, the very obvious cause is that there will be damages due to the consequences and the impact of the crisis. For example, there will be floodings, storms, wildfires, and also the effects of that on infrastructure. For example, rivers that are very dry and you can't ship them anymore. All that will, of course, also affect companies, and they will be able to make less profit because of that, because of these consequences of the climate crisis. So basically, this is one way on how the climate crisis has a negative impact on financial markets, because of course, if a lot of companies are struck by natural catastrophes, this will have very negative impacts on the economy and therefore also on financial markets. And for example, they can't pay back their loans anymore, and then maybe banks go bankrupt that have lent money to them. And the second cause why the climate crisis can actually have negative impacts on the financial markets is if suddenly governments realize that, oh, we live in a climate crisis and we should do something against it, and they implement very strict policies that will make it impossible for companies that are heavily investing or making profits from fossil fuels to continue to make these profits in the future. And basically, bonds and loans, of course, are very long-term investment. And if in 5 to 10 years, suddenly we have a lot of policies that will make it impossible to earn money, for example, with burning fossil fuels, which hopefully we will have very soon, then of course all these assets will be worthless because those companies can't really make any profit with that anymore. So the problem at the moment is that many businesses that are very carbon intensive, that means that they pollute a lot and emit a lot of CO2, hide these facts and do not really openly talk about how much CO2 they emit. And of course, they're also very interested in not changing their behavior, because at the moment it's profitable. And of course, although in the future the climate crisis will have very, very negative consequences on our economies, they still don't want to change it. And they, of course, lobby governments not to implement harsher climate policies because that would be detrimental to their profits. So this is like the general framework, how things are looking at the moment. Now, what's the role of the ECB in the climate crisis and the economic and the ecological damages and ecological collapse that we're seeing right now? Because, of course, it's more than just the climate crisis. We live in an era of ecological collapse and very rapid ecological collapse that will have impacts on all of our lives, because if we don't have ecosystems anymore that give us like the life support we need, like water and food, for example, or clean air, then of course the climate is just a secondary problem to us. So the problem itself is way bigger than just a climate crisis, and the ECB hasn't really acknowledged that yet. Now, what's the role of the ECB in all of that? So the European Central Bank is the central organ of money supply in the Eurozone. And the Eurozone is quite big. It's one of the largest economies in the world. And the European Central Bank basically controls the money and controls inflation. Now, I'm not going to talk about exactly how it works in detail, but just about the aspects that are relevant to the climate crisis now. This is the primary target, the primary goal of the European Central Bank: money supply, inflation, keep inflation at roughly below 2%. And then there's also a secondary goal, that is the task of the ECB, and that's to just support the general economic policies of the European Union. And one of the economic policies of the European Union is supposedly to combat the climate crisis. Now, of course, the European Union doesn't really have a comprehensive plan that would actually do that, but at least they're trying to, and they're doing very, very little steps that are, of course, not enough and sometimes go into the wrong direction. But generally speaking, they say they try to combat climate change. Now, there's several ways the ECB is doing harm. So first of all, during the COVID crisis, the ECB actually started a so-called pandemic emergency purchase program. So that means that the ECB says, okay, we have an economic crisis because of COVID and we don't want deflation, so we will flood the market with money. So they buy a lot of bonds in the financial markets. Buying bonds basically means lending out money to companies, and lots of these companies are fossil fuel companies that, of course, pollute the environment and are responsible for a lot of CO2 emissions. And they do that because they say they want to pursue it in a market neutral way. So they say they just buy assets and bonds. Well, they buy bonds on the market just as they are given out. But of course, there are lots of fossil fuel companies. And actually, in relative terms, there's a carbon bias. So that means that the European Central Bank actually buys disproportionately many bonds from fossil fuel companies, and therefore, of course, fuels their business and the climate crisis. In the past, until 2019, they also bought just regularly bonds on the open market. There they also bought a lot of bonds from fossil fuel companies, billions and billions of money pumped into fossil fuel companies, public money by the European Central Bank. And there's another problem that's just a general problem about how the ECB functions, and that is the ECB lends money to commercial banks because commercial banks need money and they get it from the ECB. But if they want to borrow money from the ECB, they in exchange have to give them a sort of security, and this is called in the financial world a collateral. A collateral is basically a security that you will pay back the loan, and if you default, then the collateral is the security for the ECB. Now, there are different forms of assets that can be given as a collateral that basically a commercial bank gives to the ECB as a security. For example, this could be corporate bonds from different companies and also, of course, from fossil fuel companies. So what that means is, for example, a commercial bank, say Deutsche Bank, wants to borrow money from the ECB, and they have lent out money to, let's say, Shell, an oil company, and they give this bond. So that a bond is nothing else than, in effect, a loan. So they lend money to Shell, and of course Shell has to pay back the loan, and they give this loan to the ECB as collateral. And in exchange, they can borrow money from the ECB. Now, the problem with that is that giving these dirty bonds from fossil fuel companies or other carbon-intensive industries and companies to the ECB, of course, is an incentive in the financial markets and a sign that they are secure investments. That is a very bad thing because, of course, we need to get rid of these industries as quickly as possible, and we have to get rid of all the bad investments that these companies undertake. But if their bonds are seen as this secure collateral that commercial banks can give the ECB, of course, there's no incentive to divest from them. And that is a very huge problem. Actually, the corporate bonds from fossil fuel industries have a relatively low haircut. And what that means is that the European Central Bank basically ranks the collateral they get, so for example corporate bonds, on how secure they are and how much money they can lend out in return. So commercial banks don't have to give 100% of the money they want to borrow as collateral, but only a certain percentage. But corporate bonds from fossil fuel companies are actually have a very low haircut, so that means that they are seen as very secure, and commercial banks in exchange can borrow a lot of money from the ECB for them. Now, that of course is again a bias towards fossil fuel money, and the ECB in this way really fuels these and really funds these fossil fuel companies. Now, very broadly speaking, this is the problem that we're facing right now. The ECB doing all this negative and harmful funding in the financial markets. So there are some ideas on how to solve that. For example, one idea is that we really need to stop financing these fossil fuel companies and other carbon intensive businesses and companies. So one step would be to not accept corporate bonds from fossil fuel industries or just in general other carbon intensive companies as collateral anymore. And that would be a very dramatic shift in policy and would dramatically cut funding to those companies, because commercial banks would know that they can't take these bonds anymore as collateral in order to get new, fresh money from the ECB. That would be a major blow to fossil fuel companies and a major win for everyone else who's not owner and benefiter of fossil fuel companies. What would happen then is that banks would have to give other bonds as collateral to the ECB, which would be greener or more environmentally friendly by comparison. And that would of course signal to the markets that it's better to invest money in low carbon companies and low carbon businesses. This would of course also be then an incentive for companies themselves, be they fossil fuel companies or other companies, to decarbonize, because only that way they can secure cheap loans in the future or good loans in the future. And of course, another measure would be to force companies and banks to disclose their carbon related risks, because at the moment we don't have really clear rules for businesses to disclose how much CO2, for example, they emit. And if we have these clear rules from the ECB setting the rules for the entire financial system, of course that would be a major win, and it would help us see which companies are harmful and how harmful they are. And it would of course also be a very symbolic sign to show that CO2 emissions are seen as something bad in the financial markets. Now, of course, there's some blowback to that, and there are people who are against that. Of course, the fossil fuel companies are against that. I mean, come on, this is a given. They are the basically evil players that destroy our very livelihoods, and this is not somehow an exaggeration. This is just, I think, a very sober analysis of what's going on if you look at the science. Now, the European Central Bank has actually, or rather the head of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde, has pledged that the European Central Bank would fight climate change and help fighting climate change. Now, there are some people, for example, the head of the German Bundesbank, which is the National Central Bank of Germany, Jens Weidmann, and also, for example, a Belgian member of the Governing Council of the European Central Bank, Pierre Wunsch, who are very much against that and say, no, we have to remain market neutral and we cannot favor businesses that are greener than others, because it's very difficult to it's very difficult to categorize that, and would be a bit arbitrary if the European Central Bank does that. The European Central Bank is not elected, so it's not their role, and governments could do it more effectively and efficiently by setting climate policies. Now, of course, governments should set very, very harsh and ambitious climate policies that would basically phase out fossil fuels as quickly as possible. But as long as they are not doing that, or just even if they are doing that, that's of course not an argument for the ECB not to act unilaterally if they are legally allowed to do so. To do. And also another very dumb argument brought forward is, for example, that we don't have enough knowledge of the impact of climate change in order to assess which monetary policies of the ECB would be the best and most effective. Now, this whole debate actually really reflects a kind of delusion that we have in our financial system and the moral bankruptcy of people really believing in this madness of going on like this, right? So those people in the ECB and debating whether the ECB, or rather opposing the ECB taking action, it's pure madness. I mean, if you look at the science, we are in a state of environmental collapse. The Paris Agreement is just the bare minimum, and all the policies combined globally now are not nearly enough to reach the targets of the Paris Climate Accord. Not to speak of all the other environmental damages and catastrophes that are going on that are associated, or rather are connected with the climate crisis. I mean, it's more than that. It's the destruction of natural habitats, of the environment, of ecosystems, the depletion of resources at a rate that are so incredibly unsustainable. It is pure madness not to act and to defund and destroy the fossil fuel industry immediately. The fossil fuel industry cannot exist if we want to exist. And the fact that this is not seen by those in power in the ECB is actually very sad. So we'll see how it goes in the future. The fact that more and more environmental catastrophes will destroy parts of our economies will of course force governments and probably also the ECB to act. But the way it looks now is that once those negative impacts materialize, and they materialize on a scale large enough to cause some form of, transitional and transformative and radical systemic change that we need, basically the end of exploitation of nature and people, if that happens, or rather when that happens, it will be too late to change. Of course, I mean, there's still the possibility that there will be other forms of technologies, geoengineering, or maybe other technologies that allow for the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But there's really no certainty that this is going to happen and that we can deploy these technologies at a scale fast enough to mitigate the problem in any significant way, or even we're not sure about the side effects of them. So it's pure madness not to stop carbon emissions right now and to stop the destruction of natural habitats and the environment now. And if you look at the whole discourse and the whole arguments exchanged here, whether it's the ECB's role to change their monetary policy to help combat climate change, everybody has to combat climate change, all institutions. And the fact that this is not happening is very bad. But change is coming, whether we like it or not, as Greta Thunberg famously said. And in that sense, there will be changes. And the changes will be radical because they will have to be radical. And we really have to fight that those changes will come quickly. You just watched a video of the European Report. On this channel, you get news and commentary on European politics and policies from a left-wing perspective. We talk about the EU, human rights, the economy, environmental and climate action, and much more. If you don't want to miss any new videos, hit the subscribe and notification button. Thanks for watching.